Hello, everyone. It is an honor, it is a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for, well, this morning for us, for some of you guys who are watching this evening, Marissa Maren. Good morning to you. And how are you today?
I'm doing well. Good morning, Tommy. Good evening to everybody in Indonesia and in the other side of the world.
Hey, Marissa, let me ask you a quick question. Is before I ask you to share and present, we're going to have you present for about 25 minutes. I'm going to come back and ask you some follow-up questions, but share with us a little bit of what you do, but your leadership journey in terms of your corporate work life.
Sure. So I actually went to college to study engineering. I did an internship and realized that I didn't quite like it. So then I went into some business courses and got my first job on Wall Street at a company called Lehman Brothers that some of you may have heard about or read about in the US. And that as soon as I got there, basically the company fell apart and collapsed. And so it taught me a lot of lessons about what really matters in work and why I want to work. What are my motivations for working? I then went on to work in a family business, which makes clothing. And so at that point, at around age 25, I moved to Indonesia from New York City and started to work with my uncle and my cousins. And that's how I ended up in Indonesia for the last 10 years almost now. And so we make clothing for global brands, mostly in the United States, but also in Japan and Europe. And we employ thousands of women, and we're very proud of that. This year has been difficult for retail and for our industry, but we are keeping our heads up and keeping our heads high and looking forward to the future.
And Marissa, during our Q&A, we are so going to talk about Lehman Brothers and some of the things that you saw, but the instability of everything that was happening. So, but before that, I'm going to turn it over to you to work on, to share with your presentation today.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. And I just wanted to say that I appreciate everybody taking time to be here with us and being on Zoom. And I just really hope that this time can just foster some questions and some reflections for all of us as we think about our leadership. So I'd like to talk a little bit about leading through crisis today. And there's actually an ancient figure from the ancient world called Nehemiah that I have learned a lot from, and I hope you will too. So a few starting points to get us going. I want to talk a little bit about what is leadership. What do we mean when we say leadership? And who was this man named Nehemiah? And what was his cultural context during his time? So first, leadership. Nelson Mandela, famous president of South Africa, he said this: "A leader is like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go out ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they are being directed from behind." Albert Einstein, famous scientist and physicist, he said this: "The leader is one who out of the clutter brings simplicity, out of discord, harmony, and out of difficulty, opportunity." Eleanor Roosevelt was the longest serving First Lady of the United States. And she said this: "A good leader inspires people to have confidence in the leader, and a great leader inspires people to have confidence in themselves." Henry Kissinger, he was a Secretary of State for the United States, and he said this: "The task of the leader is to get his people from where they are to where they have not been." So here are a lot of interesting ideas about leadership from various prominent leaders in our time. But I'd like to talk about just one idea now today, which is this: leadership in a single word is influence. So now let's jump into who Nehemiah was. Nehemiah was actually a Jew. He was born in Persia, and this is during the 5th century BC. What he did as his job was he was the cupbearer to the king. What does this mean? What it means is that he would test the food and drink of the king before he ate or drank, so that he would make sure that the king was not going to be poisoned. So what this meant is that he lived in the palace with the king. He was a very important figure, and he had a lot of influence over the king. Now, Nehemiah, what he did as his work in addition to being a cupbearer, is that when he heard about his ancient city of Jerusalem, which was the city of his forefathers, when he heard about the destruction that was happening in that city, he actually summoned the king and he said, I would like to rebuild the walls of this city. This is a 140-year-old problem, actually, that was nowhere near Nehemiah's current day. But he said, okay, this is something that mattered to my ancestors, to my forefathers, to my people. And so I'm going to go and rebuild those walls. And he did that successfully, even though there was a lot of difficulty and a lot of toil. And then he went on to serve as governor for 12 years after that. So what is the cultural context? If we move back another 5 centuries, around 931, the country of Israel was actually ruled by one king. When he died, King Solomon died, the country split. There was civil war and 10 tribes moved to the north and 2 tribes moved down to the south. So the people became divided. Now, several centuries later, another king called Nebuchadnezzar, he actually took over the whole area. He invaded their capital city. So it's like someone coming into Jakarta, breaking everything down, taking the ports, stealing everybody's belongings, and coming in and burning the buildings and basically burning everything that the country had built up over many centuries. So Nehemiah has been born into a people group that has been out of their homeland for 140 years, and he's living 800 miles away from the city that his ancestors lived in Jerusalem. So now when we look at city walls, why is that important? Well, back then, the city walls were a huge source of protection for the people. And if they didn't have these walls, then enemies could come in and rob them and loot them and even kill them. And so in Jakarta, I know so many of us live in gated communities, or in our homes, we might have gates, or we might live in apartment complexes or coasts where there's some level of security. If you go into many buildings, there's security. So, and I would say Jakarta is quite a safe city. That's how I feel. But, imagine being in a place where all of those securities are down and you actually have enemies that are coming and trying to sabotage your life. So this is the context. Now, what I'd like to do is just to talk a little bit about what I've learned from this story of Nehemiah, take it as a case study. So what I see in him is he actually leads himself very well. And there are 2 areas we'd like to talk about today. One is preparing for a big endeavor. In his case, he was preparing to build a wall. And the second is managing emotions. How do we face other people? How do we even deal with ourselves when we are discouraged? So first, preparing for a big endeavor. What we see Nehemiah doing is he prepares for the right time. What happened was his brother actually had traveled from Jerusalem and told him about the news in the month of December that the city walls were completely destroyed and they were getting worse and worse over time. So he didn't actually act right away, but he spent time thinking, considering, reflecting, what should he even do? Should he even consider leaving his job as cupbearer of the king? Would he even be able to do that? Or would the king say, this is a ridiculous request and off with your head? And so what Nehemiah did was he really thought about what to do and he waited for the right timing. So for us too, as we think about big projects in our lives, what is the right timing? Is it always the right time to act when we feel a sense of urgency, or is it sometimes better to wait? So next, making a plan. When he asked the king, when he told the king of the situation, the king said, well, what would you like to see happen? And Nehemiah gave a definitive timeline for his absence. He also asked basically for a passport because he needed to travel 800 miles from the king's palace to Jerusalem through different regions. And so he would need to present papers to those different governors saying, I have permission from the king to travel back to Jerusalem. And third, he actually asked the king for wood from his forest in order to make the beams for the gates of the city wall so that there would be an opening and a closing that would be safe and secure. And finally, we see that Nehemiah is not just physically prepared for a long journey ahead, but he's also mentally and emotionally prepared. When he arrives in Jerusalem, he's actually faced with so much opposition and people are mocking this project. They're saying, what a ridiculous project. Do you really think you can do this? Who are you going to have to help you do this work? But he actually stays very laser focused on his mission. And he is ready for the fact that this is a big project and I will have a lot of opposition and I'm going to continue forward in my mission. The other interesting thing in his story, when we read his memoirs, is that when he arrived in Jerusalem, he didn't get to work right away, but rather he stopped for a few days and he actually reflected and thought about what he should do and made sure that he was ready to go forward. And finally, what we see in him is that he critically examines the situation. He doesn't just gloss over the situation, but he really carefully, consciously goes and probes the situation at the wall. He wants to see the details. He wants to see, how does this wall need to be fixed? What kinds of craftsmen do I need? What kind of equipment do I need? And he had a very strong work ethic. He stayed up at night often to examine the situation and to make a proper plan forward. So I just want to take a bit of time now to reflect on ourselves and our leadership. When we are faced with accomplishing a big project, what does it look like to wait for the right timing? What makes it hard to wait for the right timing? When we go to make a plan, how do we balance planning with improvising? And what are the principles that we use to guide our planning? Are there certain values or points that are very important to us that we always use when we are making plans? And then finally, how do we balance both the short-term plans as well as the long-term plans, the plans for today and this week versus the plans for this month and this year or even next year? Being ready for the journey ahead means that we might face people who say that our ideas are ridiculous. They might think that our plans make no sense. And we have to be very clear on what our mission is. How do we respond to other people? Maybe there are superiors who are disagreeing with us. What is the way that we can actually show patience towards that? And then, do we as leaders practice times of reflection and solitude in our day? I know for me, this is something that I try to do, and some days are better than others. But in the midst of working from home, sometimes in the midst of managing a business in the middle of a pandemic, what does it look like to take time to reflect and to think about how we are leading, what we can do better, and what we need to also keep doing, maybe things that are going very well in our leadership? And finally, how do we critically examine the situation in order to rebuild? I know that in many companies today, we're seeing a loss of business, a loss of revenue. Some of our customers might be going down, struggling. So how do we examine the situation? What about our own internal companies? How can we look at the processes and systems to keep people motivated, to keep them performing? And so these are just some questions we can ask ourselves as we think about rebuilding anything that might need to be rebuilt in our organizations, as well as our families. I think all of these points are relevant as well to our families, to our neighbors, to our communities. So when we lead ourselves, it's not just for our companies or for our work from day to day, but it's also all throughout our week, all throughout our weekends, and how we lead ourselves in all of life. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is managing our emotions and overcoming discouragement. There's a quote by Charles Swindoll, and he says this: "Leadership appears glamorous and glorious, but it's often lonely and thankless." And I can definitely say that in my own journey, I have definitely experienced many moments of loneliness and many moments of feeling like I'm the only one and I don't always know what to do. And so there are those temptations to become easily discouraged. And when we look at Nehemiah's story in rebuilding this wall of this ancient city, as I mentioned, there was mockery, there was opposition, there was criticism, and there was just so much negativity. And I have to be honest, when there's so much negativity around us, it is hard not to have it seep into our mindset, have it affect our day. And so I think an important piece of dealing with discouragement is first being able to understand the causes. So one common cause is a loss of strength. We see this in Nehemiah's story. When people are building the wall, they start stumbling, they start staggering, and they're only halfway through building the wall and they're losing their physical strength. And so what we can see is that, it's not just the physical strength, it's also the emotional strength. And that gets into the next point, which is a loss of vision. The people he was leading were complaining about the rubble and the rubbish, and there was basically garbage everywhere all around the wall, and they were trying to build a new wall in the midst of all of this garbage. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to build anything or start a new project, or even say cooking in your kitchen, if you're cooking in a mess and you're trying to make something beautiful in a mess, it can be quite difficult, right? We want to have a clean place to start with so that we can start preparing that meal or start preparing that project. But in his situation, there's debris, there's disorder everywhere, and that is a huge source of discouragement. The third thing we see is the loss of confidence. The workers that he was dealing with were saying, we're just not able to do this anymore. We can't. And so he had to actually deal with this confidence loss, which is makes sense that it came together with this sense of loss of vision, a loss of strength, then also came a loss of confidence. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, the last thing we see is the loss of security. The people surrounding Jerusalem were rumoring to kill them and attack them when they least expected it. So just imagine you're building this wall, you're trying to rebuild this sense of protection, while at the same time you're hearing all these rumors that any moment someone could come and kill you. So this sense of security is an important one to be aware of. And when we do lose our security, we might find security in our work. We might find security in our home, in our family, in our friends. And sometimes, and I'm sure during this pandemic, we have all faced a sense of wondering, will these things disappear? Will they be gone? And how do we deal with that? How do we respond if the things where we find our security are being taken away? So let's now talk about how to overcome discouragement. One thing is for sure that we cannot ignore it. So we have to deal with it sometimes head on, sometimes maybe from the side, but we must deal with it. First is repositioning and refocusing. What we see Nehemiah doing when his people are discouraged is he actually stopped the work. He said, okay, let's take a break, let's reposition ourselves. And he physically moved people into groups so that they could have one another's support. And what he essentially said is, let's pull together as families. Let's not do this alone. And the next thing we see is that he basically has people live together in community. He's not saying, as I mentioned, do this alone, but let's fight this fight together. So what he actually had was a signal. He said, okay, when the trumpet sounds, run to the gathering point so that you know that if there is an enemy attack, you will not have to face this alone. And so I think for us too, as leaders, wherever we are, we must remember that whatever challenges we are facing, difficulty, discouragement, that we need not walk through it alone, but we can actually build into our friendships where we really have trusted friends, build into those relationships where we might have advisors, that we can just talk through and walk through challenging times together. And I know that even in this forum, with, for example, Tommy, I know that he is someone that I can go to and say, I'm struggling with this. Do you have any ideas? And so just finding people, they might be people you talk to every week. There might be some people you only talk to every month or every few months, but finding those people is so important in our leadership journey. So as we think about what to do in the face of discouragement, first is just understanding the causes. Can we see in ourselves any loss of physical, emotional, or mental strength? Do we feel that in our companies and in our organizations, we need to maybe reinforce the vision, not just for others, but first for ourselves? Are we very clear on why we are doing things and what we are going after? What about confidence? How do we act in a way where we are actually walking forward with confidence, not arrogance, but a sense of humble confidence as we go forward? And finally, what are the areas where we really find security, and are those areas of security stable? Will they last through the duration? Or are these areas that are a bit shaky? And how can we build our resilience even if we do lose these things that are so important to us? So next is dealing with discouragement. Now, how can we reposition ourselves towards the goal? And who are those people, as I mentioned, that we can have alongside us as we go through difficult times? So now we've talked a little bit about what it looks like to lead ourselves. Now let's talk about leading others. And what we see in the story of Nehemiah is he does 4 things. He sets his priorities. He resolves conflict when it arises. He serves other people sacrificially. And he actually is intentional about celebrating. So first, setting priorities. One thing we see him do once he completes the wall is he raises up leaders. He chooses 2 leaders because he knows that he can't lead this city by himself, but he needs other people to help him. So he chooses 2 men. The first is Hanani, and this is the man who had alerted Nehemiah in the beginning to the problems of the city. The second person is Hananiah, and he is the commander of the citadel in Persia. And so basically he's a military leader. He's a man who has a lot of integrity. And so these are people that Nehemiah chooses. Now, when we are thinking about raising up leaders in our own organizations, I know for some of you who might be younger in your 20s or 30s, you might be wondering, well, should I even be raising up a next generation? And I would say, yes, it's something that no matter what your age is, we should be constantly thinking about who we are mentoring, who we are training, who can take up our job next year, maybe, or in a couple of years, or maybe even next month. How can we continually regenerate leadership? The next thing we see Nehemiah do is he protects the people. So he's established this wall, and now it's fully built. And now what he does is he actually says, okay, we're only going to open the gates during midday, because then we will ensure that we will not be attacked. Because when the gates are open, people could come in. So the final thing he does is he appoints different residents who are living around the city to guard the wall at strategic posts. So if my home is near the wall in one strategic location, then he has appointed me to help guard that area. And so what we see here is him really thinking about how to maintain a sense of security and to protect people. And as we are working in organizations, it's an important thing to think about especially during this pandemic, where a lot of people might be living in fear, they might be living in anxiety. They might not feel safe. They might not feel safe in their job. They might not feel safe in their home, in their neighborhood. And so what does it look like to help protect people? It might be work from home policies, but even when we work from home, how do we ensure that those healthy boundaries are still in place? Because now your bedroom is your office. It might be your kitchen also, if you're living in a one-room place. And so what does it look like to actually, if I'm a leader, to make sure that I say, okay, we've done enough work today. Why don't you go and enjoy your dinner? Or maybe it's on the weekends. Maybe you have to work on a Saturday, but say, okay, let's take Sunday just to rest and let's not do any calls. And so it might be small things like that where we put in place boundaries to help protect the people that we are leading. So if we just take a moment here to reflect, what are the skills that we want to develop in people that are on our teams? And what do we see as key ingredients for the future leaders of our companies and of our teams? The next thing that we can think about is protecting people. And how well do we feel that we are actually helping to protect people who are under our influence? I'm in manufacturing, and there are many, many people who work. And so for the work that I do, a lot of it is in looking at our policies. Are we creating policies and rules in our company that are helping people flourish? Or are we creating policies that are actually making it so that people are struggling more? So the next thing we see Nehemiah doing is resolving conflict. Now, as leaders, we must not ignore problems, even though I know it's a temptation to just run away from problems when they arise. But what we see Nehemiah doing is he doesn't run away from problems. Now, what happened during the building of the wall is that there was a famine. This meant that food was running out. And so the people, especially the poor people, they were selling their fields, they were selling their vineyards, they were borrowing money from the rich at very high interest rates. And this was actually against the law. Children were being sold into slavery, which is so heartbreaking. And I know that this is an issue that continues until today and happens all across the world, Indonesia, the US, it happens everywhere. And it's just a sad state when people are struggling so much that they have to make drastic decisions, or they choose to make drastic decisions. So now Nehemiah, he doesn't say, okay, these are your problems, I have a wall to build, but he instead addresses the problem actually. And in doing this, it was actually not an easy job because he had to deal with other leaders of the city. This was not a problem where it was just people who are subordinate to him, but this was a situation where he had to deal with other leaders and actually possibly challenge their leadership. So the next thing we see in Nehemiah's story is he is patient and self-controlled. If you read his memoir, what he actually says is he's actually quite angry that this is happening, but he doesn't, when we see how he responds, he's not responding in anger, he's not flaring a temper, but he is actually patient and self-controlled as he thinks about what is the best option and way forward. The third thing we see Nehemiah do is he actually practices healthy confrontation. So the first step when we need to confront someone that we see Nehemiah doing, and that I also believe is important, is to address the issue privately. So when we go to someone one-on-one, what we do is we help build trust. We avoid any gossip that can unnecessarily go around the organization. And it's also important because sometimes it's just a misunderstanding, a simple lack of communication or poor communication. And then another possibility is that perhaps that person is actually really struggling. Maybe they really need a helping hand. So it's very important to go one-on-one. And I know that as I've worked throughout the years, I have seen different leaders approach confrontation in different ways. And, I think especially in Indonesia, it's very common not to address an issue because culturally maybe we don't want to disrespect people. But then other times you'll see some people be very angry, and in a meeting with a lot of people, they will put one person down. And I always find that very heartbreaking. And I try not to do that as a leader as well, although maybe I might have accidentally done that. But I think it's important to catch ourselves when we are tempted to do that. And it's just so healthy and helpful to go to someone one-on-one and say, here's something that I think needs to be addressed. And in my experience, when I've done that, people actually respond quite well. Now, when that doesn't work, when you've tried addressing someone one-to-one and it does not work, it might be necessary to call a slightly bigger group of people. So this is what Nehemiah did. He actually called together a bigger group to help resolve the conflict. And this might be needed if a witness is needed or evidence needs to be considered. And I know in some cases in the business, it might be that a customer is claiming that they never received their product or their service. It could be that, like in our organization in manufacturing, we're making clothing, and sometimes there are stolen goods and they disappear. Sometimes the clothing is stolen and then sold on Tokopedia or other online platforms. And so in those cases, we really do need to go into the background and what is the evidence and what is the witnesses? Do we know what really happened in this situation? So the next thing we see is setting the example. What Nehemiah does is he doesn't just say, oh, this is what you should do, but he sets the example in his own life. So what he does when the more poor people around him are struggling, he lends them food, he lends them grain, but he doesn't do it in a way where it puts more pressure and more interest and more burden on them. And so I think what we need to do as leaders is to really practice what we preach, that if we believe in something, that we are doing as much as possible in our own lives to make sure that we are also following that practice. The next thing we see Nehemiah do is that he encourages restitution. What is restitution? Restitution is basically not only saying that we will stop doing this practice, but actually paying back anything that was taken. So we see that when the rich people took the land, they took people as slaves, they took interest. Nehemiah said, you have to give back all of these things. Give back the land, give back the people, and give back the interest. And then the last thing we see him doing is accountability. He brings in the priests. And so in this context, the priests are the religious leaders, and they were needed in order for the other leaders to take an oath and to say, I promise that I will not do this again. Now, in our companies, maybe priests are not relevant. Maybe that's someone else. It might be HR if your company is big enough. If you're a startup, it could be maybe your investors or your board of advisors, or could be just perhaps other trusted friends and mentors. But to really sometimes bring in people around us to help us stay focused on our mission, and maybe 3 months later, 6 months later, to ask us and check in and say, hey, I know you were trying to grow in this area. How is that going now? Are you making the progress that you wanted to see? So just a few reflection questions here is, do we tend to avoid conflict or address it? And when we do, how can we do so in a healthy way? When we feel upset and angry about a situation, are we responding in patience? Are we responding with self-control? And when we do need to confront people, are we confronting them in a healthy way, or are we publicly shaming them in an unhealthy way? Are we setting an example in our own lives of the kind of leadership that we want to see? Do our actions match our words? What about restitution? If something has been stolen or taken, are we fully paying it back? And in accountability, are there people around us, whether it's in our companies or outside our companies, that can help us stay on track with the goals that we have. The next thing we see Nehemiah doing is he serves other people sacrificially. Now, remember in the beginning of the story, he is living a pretty nice life. He is living in the palace of the king. And he has many reasons not to travel 800 miles. Remember, this is before any cars or highways, no motorcycles, no way to travel a long distance easily, but he chooses to get involved. And I think it's important here for us to think also, in the middle of a pandemic, it's so easy to be concerned about our own problems and not about the problems of others. And so these are some ideas, is it that we are feeling apathetic, that we just really don't care about a problem if it doesn't affect us? Maybe we feel helpless. The problem just seems way too big for us to solve. Maybe we don't want to take more responsibility, that maybe if we don't know too much, then we don't have to get involved. Maybe we're just too busy, too distracted, have so many other things on our plate. Or maybe we just say to ourselves, someone else will take care of this. This is not for me to address. Now, the next thing we see Nehemiah doing is he identifies with the failures of others. And I think as we look at our own leadership, do we say, oh yeah, you lied in that situation, or you didn't exercise discipline? Or do we say, actually, yes, you did lie, but I remember a time when I've also lied. Or yes, you did lack discipline, but I remember a time when I've also lacked discipline. And so can we, it's not saying basically that lying and lacking discipline is good, but it's at least expressing empathy and saying, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Let's both attack this challenge together, and let's try to become better as people, as workers, as leaders. The last thing we see him doing is that he takes responsibility alongside the team. Once again, he's using words like we and us. He doesn't use words like, oh, this is your problem, you did this, and saying basically, I get to take the credit when things go well, but it's your problem when things don't go well. So this is something I've seen sometimes in my own career, that there are some people that will really blame other people when things go wrong. So I think for us as leaders, it's so easy to fall into that temptation. But do we finally, if we are the leader, do we finally say, okay, I'm going to take responsibility for this situation? Maybe I didn't even do the action that was wrong, but that person's on my team and I'm going to take responsibility for it. Is that something we are willing to do as leaders? So a few questions here, when we see issues around us, are we willing to get involved? And it's not to say that we have to get involved in every problem, but are we at least concerned? Maybe we respond with a word of encouragement or asking how we can help. When there are problems and failures in other people, do we identify with them, and do we have some sense of empathy and compassion for them as we respond? And finally, when things go wrong, or even when things go well, are we taking responsibility as a team, or are we just saying, oh no, I get to take credit for the good things and it's your fault when the things happen that are bad? So the last thing we see in Nehemiah is that he practices celebration. Now, in the middle of a pandemic, I can definitely say that some days can be very hard and we don't know what to celebrate. We don't see much joy. Maybe we see just a lot of bad news all the time. But the reality is that even if we have good disciplines, maybe we wake up and we go for a run or exercise, or maybe we have a discipline of reading every day. But sometimes even these good disciplines can become dull. They can feel like a chore. And so it's so important to actually celebrate regularly, daily, monthly, yearly. What we see Nehemiah doing is he planned this celebration. Once the wall was done, he invited talented musicians to come and be a part of a large celebration. So he took time to make sure that it was a grand celebration. The other thing is he starts from the top. He doesn't just have the people who did the work celebrate, but he has everybody in the city from the top lead the celebration. And when this happened, everybody started to celebrate. The women, the children who didn't even build the wall, their happiness and their joy was heard from so far away. And this had amazing lasting effects. And I can definitely say from the work that I've done, when we are doing our manufacturing in a way that is helping the communities around us and leaves the communities in a better state, when we help to rebuild a road that is broken, or maybe there's a flood that happens or a volcano that erupts and we need to replant trees, when we actually those might be bad situations, but then when we rebuild and celebrate that rebuilding, the whole community is so much better off. And so the last thing we see here is that Nehemiah actually is intentional in expressing gratitude. And I think, in Indonesia, one great thing about the culture is that it's a very grateful culture. And I think that that's something that we should definitely, as leaders, continue to do and to practice in our day to day, to give thanks and appreciate people when they do things well. And this is so important because otherwise, worry can creep into our lives. We can tend to complain, which only drains our energy. And so just really being intentional about celebrating each and every day is so important. So what are the ways that you actually practice celebration in your own life and in your own company? Are you, as a leader, serving with joy? Are you just being very disciplined, or are you also starting from the top and saying, okay, yes, this is a time when we can celebrate? And then are we, as leaders, giving thanks? Are we appreciating people when they do things well? I remember, even in the midst of this pandemic, one of the best things that we did as a company was during the breaking of the fast during the Ramadan season. We couldn't meet in person, so we had everybody get on a Zoom, even together with their families, and it was just a time just to talk. And we said some prayers for our Muslim brothers and sisters, but it was just such a nice time where we could all just connect. And we only did that, I think, twice last year. We did it for Ramadan. We did it also for a birthday celebration, but it was something that I think was a highlight actually for me during the year. And I think we need to do more as an organization. So let me leave you just with this one thought, which is that leadership is influence. And as we go tomorrow and the next day, remember that leadership is a practice. It's something that we will be continuously working on every single day and continuously honing. So I hope you can take some of these thoughts and questions, and maybe it's just one thing from today. Just choose one thing that you think, okay, that's something I would like to work on, in order that my influence might help people and help our organization and help ultimately the country of Indonesia grow and flourish from this day forward. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.